I'm George Gallo, and I present كلمة on الميادين television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on الميادين television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing New Zealand, although the reverberations, the earthquake that happened less than 2 months ago in New Zealand has reverberated around the world. Or has it? Because that's my first point. It's less than 2 months ago, and most people have already forgotten it. If it had happened to 50 worshippers in any other religious institution, we'd still be talking about it. It would still be right at the top of the news agenda. It has scarred New Zealand, to be sure, and the response of the New Zealand people, Parliament, and Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has been a model of societal civic response. And the Prime Minister found the words and found the actions to respond so beautifully, so movingly, that it touched the hearts of Muslims, at least around the world. The Parliament in New Zealand voted with only one vote against. I've no idea why there was one vote against, to ban almost all automatic and semi-automatic weapons for sale in New Zealand, a country with a surprisingly high level of gun ownership, including semi-automatics, hitherto. It didn't even make an impact on Australian politics, though the mass murderer of 50 men, women, and children at worship on a Friday on their holy day didn't make an impact on Australian politics at all. The same old, rebarbative, racist, Islamophobic political discourse now disfigures the Australian general election. Not a moment's contemplation from them that one of their citizens was responsible for this horrific act of mass murder. The Eiffel Tower was not lit up in the colours of New Zealand. Facebook did not change its banner to reflect the massacre of 50 innocent worshippers. As a matter of fact, when we attempted to send out text messages through our server for this program, the text message was banned as inflammatory because it contained the word massacre. What would you call the murder of 50 people other than a massacre? What would they have called it if it had been 50 Christians, 50 Jews that had been mass murdered in a place of worship? So we changed the word from massacre to New Zealand mosque attacks. That too was banned by our server. I'm telling you that seems petty, but I'm trying to make the point that not only did the New Zealand events not set the whole world alight with the danger of fascist, far-right, Islamophobic violence, they quickly forgot about it and are now actually suppressing it. How about that? Now, far-right violence, extremist violence against Muslims is the most rapidly growing hate crime in the world. But you'd never know it. You'd never know it in British political discourse, where, as the subject of one of our recent programs, by far and away, to the power of 500. There's a preoccupation with perceived anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. But it's Muslims that are being attacked, Muslims that are being murdered, mosques that are being desecrated, Muslim graves that are being desecrated in far, far, far greater and deadlier number than any other religious, or for that matter, racial group in Western countries. And actual fascists, as opposed to racists, because racists can be found everywhere in every country, but actual organized fascist organizations are on the rise throughout Europe, throughout the United States, where the election of Donald Trump and his loose-lipped, slack-jawed, intellectually ignorant language has given succor and comfort to far-right, even openly Nazi organizations in the United States. But we have them here in Britain too. Not so long ago, the Home Secretary had to proscribe, to ban an organization called National Action. I myself made a documentary film called The Patriot Game about the history of British fascism and its reincarnation in the form of organizations like National Action. You can find it on YouTube and view it. But the danger, according to the police, according to the security services themselves in Britain, the danger from far-right extremist Muslim-hating organizations in Britain is now equal to the danger of terrorist acts by Islamist fanatics of the kind that we have seen in Britain and in Europe and in the United States over recent years. So the state has woken up to the fact that under the rocks, there still exists formations, some of them armed, some of them able to access arms, training, drilling, and filling the heads of the foolish with a hatred of Muslims and people of color. I make that distinction because one of the straws in the wind of all of this is the number of Sikh people who are not Muslims, but are the right color, and who are, with some regularity, abused and attacked by those who can't tell the difference. Now, our first speaker today in this distinguished audience is a security and intelligence expert, a former British soldier, a former police officer, a man who knows what I'm talking about. It's Charles Shoebridge. Welcome to the show, Charles. Why do you think the massacre of 50 people in New Zealand less than 2 months ago is a complete non-event in the Western media now?
This event was covered quite dramatically, of course, and quite fully. But as you say, it was short-lived, the major coverage, compared to if it had been, for example, in Paris or even, of course, obviously in London. Studies have shown repeatedly, actually, academic studies, that these differences in the way that incidents are reported cannot be explained by the two factors that people usually say is the explanation, which is the proximity and also the regularity with which these things occur. Because, for example, you remember in the days of the violence in Northern Ireland, there is still violence in Northern Ireland, but when it was much worse, it would rarely make the front pages of even the British newspapers, even if it was British soldiers that were being killed. But people would say that's because it happens all the time. But studies have shown that, for example, when, and so we would say, why is it that Palestinians being killed regularly, for example, in on the marches of the return, for example, that are happening at the moment? I don't know the figures for this week, but on average, some Palestinians in Gaza will have been killed by the Israeli security forces this week. We would have to check the alternative news sources.
The fact that neither you nor I know is remarkable enough. It tells us about the media.
We don't know because we haven't actively sorted out. I mean, I do on a kind of a monthly basis because the figures are appalling, as we know. But the fact that it's not in the media is explained because, well, it's happening all the time. That's why we wouldn't put it there, because it's nothing unusual. And people also say, but if it was in London, of course, we'd be more interested. But again and again, this is shown to be incorrect because, for example, if something happens in Moscow, it's barely reported, a terror attack. Even if a terror attack carried out by Islamist extremists will not be reported to the same degree as something involving far fewer deaths in the United States, for example, which is geographically further away. And similarly with the New Zealand case, we can't get an example that is further away, for sure. But nonetheless, it's extremely rare that an incident like that would happen in New Zealand.
Well, Charles, you say further away. That's true in geographical terms. But New Zealand is us.
But not in social terms, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, New Zealand people are, they are our people. They emigrated there from here in very large number. One would have thought that notwithstanding the miles, something happening in New Zealand would be very impactful here.
It's that's absolutely right. So what I'm saying is that these anomalies can't be explained by these factors. And indeed, that's an example of this. So it comes back to, well, what can be the reason? And you've given an explanation for that. Other people haven't been able to explain why this phenomenon happens. You mentioned about the Eiffel Tower. Again, if there's an attack that involves, for example, say there were bombings in Syria carried out by the same organizations, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, for example, they would have killed a number of Syrian civilians or Iraqi civilians or Moscow civilians. You won't see the Eiffel Tower lit up. It's usually when the victims are the kind of victims that we want to associate with. And I can't understand why, when people want to be, if you like, to call a hackneyed term, politically correct, why there wasn't more of an effort to empathize with, to engage with the communities of whom the victims in New Zealand were members of. Because it would have been a great opportunity to show that the kind of comments you've just made, and many people are making, are untrue. But instead, they just went down the same route, didn't light up the tower, we didn't have a month's memorial services, and so on and so forth. Of course, why these things are happening is a different matter, and I'm sure
we'll come on to that. I just want to put this point to you. The conclusion that most Muslims have drawn, is that not all blood has the same price. Some blood is more valuable than other blood, and that Muslim blood is the cheapest blood of all. And that is in itself a highly radicalizing, fanaticizing realization. If you were a Muslim who looked like the people who were massacred in that mosque, and you realized that nobody actually gave much of a toss about it, you'd become pretty angry, or you might become pretty radical. You might even become pretty fanatical about it. So it's not just that in terms of political correctness, and I agree with you, I don't know why they don't go the extra mile, even if they don't mean it, just for propaganda reasons. But it's the opposite. By not doing it, they're making more of the problems that they have been preoccupied by for much of the last 2.5 decades.
Indeed, and therefore it becomes, of course, a security issue for us, for the society generally. It means that, first of all, the kind of thought behaviours that led to, because it's no longer in the media discourse to the same extent that other attacks would have been, there is not, on the one hand, this understanding that people will, as you say, a small proportion, but nonetheless, when you've got a large number of people, a small proportion is still a large number of people, can become radicalized to the extent that they will want to lash out in some way, carry out terror attacks themselves, perhaps in revenge, or perhaps to send a message that actually we are important, but also to address the kind of thinking that led to these attacks taking place in the first instance. Because, for example, when we find that there were bombings from Islamist extremists, for a long time, the media discourse is dominated by thoughts of we need to understand why this happened and we need to tackle the causes of this. We need to engage with and confront extremism. But whilst that happened in the British media, certainly in American media, for a short time after the attack in New Zealand, it's short-lived. And so therefore, again, the moment passes and not much is followed up on. What I would say very quickly, because I know other people want to speak, is that the one area where people in the West, politicians and the media, have fastened on this attack is once again, as with so many previous attacks, to try and use it, not all media, not all politicians, but many, and the British government is one of those, to try and justify more clampdowns, more restrictions on freedom of speech, more restrictions on the internet, more restrictions on social and alternative media. Already we saw in the last week the governments in Britain proposing really what civil liberties groups have called North Korea-style proposals to restrict the access of UK citizens to websites and so on that the UK government or its regulator would deem to be what they call fake news or disinformation. They cited this attack in that consultation paper, and they tried to thereby say that, as they do with stories about paedophilia and other terrorism, that we need to restrict free speech in order to prevent these attacks taking place and, of course, increase the powers of the security service and so on. Notwithstanding that, it's far too early to say whether in this case, and certainly in other cases, we know that it wouldn't have made any difference, whether in the New Zealand case, these measures would have made any difference. So these attacks are used and spoken about prominently when they're useful to the political establishment's discourse.
It's a very powerful point, your last one in particular. And I gave an example of how it has affected our program today, that we were unable, I mean, short of leaving out the word attack and leaving out the word mosque, we could not have been allowed to put out our text message. This is something that never happens to me directly. Perhaps I've got too many followers, too big a mouth. Nobody ever directly censors me on the internet. Television and radio is another matter. But what I've learned today in this report I've just given, what I've learned is that other people, people with less following, people with less clout maybe, are already being ruthlessly censored. Outside of the law, and I think we have a legal case on these text messages, but nonetheless, it's a very chilling reminder of the point you've just made. Yes, sir. Why did this make so little long-lasting impact everywhere outside of New Zealand?
My name's Sharam Malik. I'm a cybersecurity expert and a student of history and modern politics. 2 reasons. First reason being that it gives a human face to the victims. So, for example, now we know the names of the 50 people who were martyred, are called the martyrs because they were praying, and their family backgrounds. So now people of all hues and colors are learning the fact that Muslims are just like us. They're human beings, they bleed, they have families, they have friends, and who will mourn their deaths. So there's a very important word that was used during the Iraq War, collateral damage. And if you read under collateral damage, or the line that said collateral damage, 55 people have died in US raid on this area. 2 terrorists were killed, but 55 innocent civilians were died, and they were considered collateral damage. Now that collateral, you're giving face to that collateral damage by saying these 50 people who died in New Zealand, were human beings. So that's one point. The second point about suppression of freedom of speech, since I work in cybersecurity, anything that you send out is monitored. Anything and everything you send out, they've got huge NSA, previously called GCHQ, monitor everything that you do, and they have a list of people that send out questionable material. Even if you believe it's secure, it's not. They can see exactly what you're saying. They know exactly who you are. They know exactly where you live. They know exactly which platforms you use to send out messages. Now, the issue is they've never had the power, or there's never been anything in the statute book to actually go after these people. Now, for example, the massacre was broadcast live on Facebook, and I watched some of the video when I woke up for morning prayer. I wish I hadn't, but I watched some of the video. Now, these people knew exactly from the first moment that it was broadcast exactly what was happening, but it was allowed to be broadcast for 21 minutes. 21 minutes. So one wonders what the actual outcome is of these regulations. These laws that are coming in are only to suppress the rational voices, the ones that go against the grain, the ones that give people an alternative view of the world, not the voices that are actually promoting extremism. Now, for example, Islamophobia is prevalent in the ruling party of the United Kingdom, the Conservative Party. One only has to go back a few years during the mayor's elections in London to see some of the rhetoric, the Islamophobic rhetoric coming from the then Prime Minister, David Cameron. It was plastered on the front page. I was in Pakistan at the time, front page of Pakistani newspapers, what he said in Parliament. Now, somebody sitting in Pakistan, reading that news, imagine what's going through their minds. Now, I have people following me from Pakistan and from all other places in the world, Muslims, and their perception is that why is it that 50 Muslims have died in a place of worship and the West is totally blind to it in a way, and they're using it for their own political means as opposed to engaging the community. Now, since then, about 50 mosques in the UK have been attacked. How many of you knew about it? 50 mosques were attacked, desecrated. I've lived in London for 22 years. I've worked in the city of London for 15 years almost. 6 years ago, I stopped traveling on the tube because I got a lot of racist abuse. I stopped traveling on the tube. Now I take a motorbike into work. I avoid using public transport. So it's there, but people are, since the 2016 referendum, it's come out. An elderly person came up to me after the referendum and said, you know what, we've got our country back now. So we used to say hello to each other every morning before I went off to work. And he said, oh, now these Muslims can't control how our laws are passed. And I turned around and said to him politely, sir, that's not what the election was about. The election was about Europe. It has nothing to do with the Muslims that live in this country. Muslims will still be here. And he was shocked. This is 2016. This is what the people said in private when they weren't broadcast. Look at the images. If you focus on the images that were portrayed by the UKIP, Nigel Farage, who all of a sudden has become a non-racist and a great humanitarian with the launch of his new party, look at the faces of the people that he had. Oh, these people are coming. They used Turkey, for example. The great liar, Boris Johnson, he used Turkey as an example. What is the majority of people in Turkey? They're all Muslims. So it's the national discourse that's got to change. It's got to change to people, human beings, blind to what color they are, what faith they are. My family has been in the UK since the 50s. My daughter is a fourth generation British national. Fourth generation. Her great-grandfather was a British national, but she's still an immigrant. When do we stop becoming immigrants?
Thank you for that. More after the break. You're watching Kalama with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, talking about New Zealand, Islamophobia, racism, and the ever-present danger of fanatic extremism. We took the Kalama camera onto the streets of London to see what the people thought. Let's take a look.
Why do you think New Zealand was targeted in this way?
I think because it's a bit of a soft target, and also because of the number of Muslims who live in there are quite low.
New Zealand was a soft spot because they didn't have the kind of violence in the past. So it was probably easier to target New Zealand than to target, let's say, a place like France or the UK.
We're witnessing more attacks in the Western world because, in a sense, Muslims, Arabs, any ethnicities that aren't European or Eurocentric are being very marginalized in the society, and that is making them have this reaction. I'm not justifying radicalism or extremism, and in a sense, people will start gravitating towards fundamental thoughts because that's what they think is right for in the moment.
Well, honestly, if you look at every country within the West that's been targeted, New Zealand's probably the most peaceful, and nothing actually goes on in New Zealand. So they wanted to obviously take terrorism into that country and blame it obviously on us Muslims as well. It's so clear. And this guy that done it, his reason was pathetic. It's been influenced by people like Tommy Robinson within this country. He can hide behind the screen, whatever, but clearly it's him.
So how will Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's handling of the aftermath serve as an example for other world leaders?
I saw the pictures on TV. I thought she was quite touched by what has happened, and she acted as a human being.
This is what should be done, and it shouldn't be something shocking, but in my opinion it's something normal, and she was very smart, not her, like the entire government in handling it, because otherwise tension would have just developed and made things even worse.
It makes me sad to see Jacinda Ardern lead in the way that she did afterwards, when I think about the fact that I'm British, and I think, was it 2012, David Cameron declared the death of multiculturalism. I know that he was talking about a political kind of point-scoring game over New Labour, but I think sometimes, especially for my generation, we don't view it as such.
Well, she was excellent. No other world leader was actually able to stand up to terrorism, let's be honest. It brought everyone together, and that's like a slap in the face for the people that want to promote terrorism. And she didn't actually blame anyone, which was great. She visited mosques, and it's not only her, it's actually the people within New Zealand as well, which were good. So I'm just going to say well done to her, well played.
Fascinating. That's the view down on the street. Abdullah, you're a scholar, a Muslim, you're British. How did the voices of the people sound to you? And what do you think was the reason behind this foul mass murder in New Zealand?
Well, I wouldn't go so far to say I'm a scholar, but perhaps just an interested party in these matters to try to see a resolution. I think the reasons behind these attacks stems from a age-old xenophobia, certainly within the nation-state model, the idea that you have a nation that represents an ethnic group or an indigenous group, and then you have invaders who are coming, even though they are legal immigrants and they've then been in this country for so long that they're now fourth and fifth generations citizens. These people are still viewed as being different from the indigenous population, and of course a danger and existential threat to the nation. I think this is not new. I think when, I suppose you said you did a kind of investigation as to the history of fascism in this country, you probably encountered that, was it 120 years ago, it was the Jewish minority in this country which was suspect.
Less, yeah, 1904, the Aliens Act was introduced to stem a flood of Jewish refugee and immigration from pogrom and murder in East and Central Europe.
And if you see a particular Conservative MP at the time, Winston Churchill, and how he was discussing Jews, he wrote this tract called Zionism versus Bolshevism, where he delineated two types of Jew. The Jew he praised was the national Jew, the Jew that was patriotic to the country they were in, and then he demonized what he called the international Jew, the Jews who believed in a international conspiracy, which is his words. So the typical anti-Semitic tropes there being reiterated by Winston Churchill. So and that the Jewish community had a duty to deal with the international Jews amongst them who believe in the ideology of Bolshevism and want to destroy Western civilization and so on and so forth. Now, the effect this had was that people viewed Jews with suspicion, because even though Winston Churchill praised the national Jews, the patriotic Jews, they had suspicion that, well, amongst them and perhaps behind any Jew, there could be the international Jew that Winston Churchill was warning us about. And the same kind of fear is generated by, I would say, our current government. That they say, yes, there are good Muslims, patriotic Muslims, Muslims who care about their country, but there is a minority within them who are internationalists. So David Cameron even said it was a concern that there are people amongst basically the Muslims who have a attachment to a international brotherhood more than an affiliation to their country. So using the same kind of argument as Winston Churchill, from the same party, ironically. And this creates suspicion against Muslims. And of course, if you want to rewind the clock even further before Muslims and Jews, it was Catholics and their popish plots to tear down and destroy this country, reimpose Catholicism and the canon law upon the English. And of course, people pointed to terrorists amongst Catholics, obviously Guy Fawkes being the famous one. And let's not forget London's 9/11, which was the Great Fire of London, which was initially blamed on a Catholic. And strangely, a Catholic even admitted that he created it, of course did. So I would have a slight disagreement with my fellow colleague, which is, while I do concede that there's many in the Muslim community which are failing in their duty to manifest the best principles of Islam, I wouldn't necessarily put all the blame on that. Firstly, you can't create or have a perfect society, a perfect community. There's always going to be criminals in any human society. And what you find with certain right-wing press is, much like the Nazis did in Germany, was they would find criminals amongst the minority they wished to demonize. Then they would advertise the crimes of these criminals and attach it to their community. So the Nazis would publish stories about Jewish criminals and say, oh, look what Jews are doing in our country, in a generalized way. And the same thing with, let's say, certain right-wing newspapers and so on. They won't say, look what Muslims are doing, but they'll say, Muslims say this, Muslims do this, and they would give disproportionate attention to Muslim crimes. So obviously terrorism being one aspect of the crimes they publish.
President Trump did it in relation to Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. He actually played a video of the Twin Towers burning whilst attacking her.
Yeah, and this is an unfortunate kind of repetition of the same thing we've seen now for at least 300 to 400 years in England, with the Catholics and then with the Jews, and then more recently Irish, and now Muslims. So I would say that there's something intrinsic within, let's say, certain nation-state concepts, certain types of nationalism, which causes this hatred of minorities and immigrants. But of course, the Muslim community in the UK, although it's more likely to be in the areas of like unemployment and in the lower kind of economic bands, in places like the United States of America or in Canada, Muslims are more affluent. They're more middle class, actually. They're actually they represent in the high grades of those who'd be most likely to be university educated, actually. So they're much more successful. But this hasn't stopped hatred and distrust of Muslims in the United States. And of course, let's not also forget that the United States was also a hotbed of anti-Semitism pre-World War II as well. And Henry Ford, the so-called great industrialist, was a rabid anti-Semite, and he wrote a tract called On the International Jew. So there's really, as long as there's going to be criminals amongst the Muslim community, the Muslim community has lost the right to have their criminals disregarded as bad apples, but rather our criminals are represented as representative of the Muslim community. And this is part of the xenophobia. And as kind of just to my last point, and concerning an earlier discussion about why is it that crimes or, let's say, massacres or atrocities that occur, even though they're not geographically proximate to the Europe, let's say, but they're given far more importance because they happen to be in a certain country, let's say a Western country, or certainly a Western country, is primarily because it's this underlying view of Western civilization as being sharing a common culture, and so people are more sympathetic, whereas rather than human life and the value of human life being a universal value. So obviously, if 30 people die if thousands of people are being killed or being persecuted in China, for example, that's China, that's not really us. But if something happens in all the way further across the world, New Zealand, that's more important if it's happening to people defined as Westerners. But my problem is that Muslims are not defined or wouldn't be considered to be Westerners. They're always considered to be outsiders. Yeah, the other, even, and surprisingly, I mean, I'm of European stock, but because I became Muslim, I wouldn't be considered Western anymore, because I've considered I've now left the fold, apostated from Western being a Westerner. And so therefore, there's a subconsciously, I would be viewed as less they'd have less sympathy towards, let's say, myself or anyone else, any other Muslim, compared to a Westerner who is viewed as indigenous, is viewed as part of the civilization. There'll be, as you rightly pointed out, the Eiffel Tower never really put a flag of New Zealand on itself too.
Quite. Anyone on the backbenchers? Yes, gentleman behind.
Two things. One is about, you asked about should this British state protect the Muslims. I'm from North London. My name's Orlando. I'm from North London, Stop the War. And what happened in our local mosque there was that Stop the War and Stand Up for Racism. On the next day, we were along with the mosque with a rally outside it, and the whole community, the priest, the vicar, and everyone was there and showing support and solidarity. I think that's how you protect it. Another thing is about...
You don't think that we should be demanding, for example, the Jewish community in North London has its own police force and its own security apparatus, and the state helps with that? You don't think the Muslims are entitled to the same thing?
Oh, no, definitely. I'm not saying that it shouldn't or it should be discarded. No. The state is, we pay the taxes, and of course. Another thing is about why, just by looking at what the people in London were saying, why New Zealand's kind of went off the radar. Could it be because of the attitude and the behavior of the Prime Minister and of the people, showing like an alternative, like what you mentioned about automatically banning automatic rifles, so showing that there is a way which doesn't have to do with demonizing Muslims?
That's a good point. Maybe they thought that the New Zealand government were showing other Western governments up. Not that New Zealand's in the West, but you know what I mean. Yes, sir.
Yes, just on the issue, sorry, I'll introduce myself, Joshua Megan, from London as well. On the issue of whether or not atrocities against Muslims are overlooked, I don't think this one was completely marginalised, okay, but at the same time, and you're right on social
media... Not at the time, it was wall-to-wall at the time. I'm just making the point, it very quickly faded.
Yes.
I tell you, God forbid, if 50 Jewish people were massacred in a synagogue in any Western country, it would run for many years. This one didn't even run for many weeks. And the reason is Muslims have now been othered in the way that Jews were othered at the beginning of the 20th century, but politics has changed. And the value of the price you might be able to put on blood has changed. The equation has changed. Go ahead.
I think the tactic or the technique of covering these things, I think it is based more on the perpetrator than the victims and what his nationality is. Because if you cast your mind back to Oklahoma City bombings, which you would probably remember better than myself, even though it was the second worst terrorist attack on American soil after 9/11, it was nobody speaks about that. I actually had to look it up. I only know about it because it was in a Guinness Book of the 20th Century, and this is only 1995. It's not that long ago. But my point is basically that the media is very selective about what it covers, what I define as selective coverage about what atrocities are foregrounded and which and how they are presented. When you look at a gunman in America, it's presented as a man who's mentally incompetent. He didn't know what he was doing. If it's an Islamist, it's Islamist inspired.
It's political and it's being organised from somewhere.
Yeah.
You brought back to my memory the massacre in Las Vegas, which was never even properly explained before it was forgotten. Thanks for that. Imran, you You're active in public affairs on behalf of the Muslim community in Britain. When you saw what happened in New Zealand, did you have the same thought as me that this could happen here?
So my name is Imran Shah. I'm from the Muslim Public Affairs Committee UK. Most definitely, we've seen so many times now where, whether it's against the Muslim community or even just like, Black Christians or Jews, like any white person who's been radicalized by, which is now a global sort of narrative that they are under attack, they are under siege. And they can literally pick up a gun, they can pick up a knife, they can go to a mosque or a synagogue or to a black church, and they can just do whatever they want. And what we have here is that a lot of these stories are happening quite a lot, but the reason we don't hear about them is the same reason why the New Zealand attack was, I think, was subdued quite later on, early on. And that is because the only reason we hear about these attacks is because it's blown up by social media. And so, yes, okay, you may have local media essentially talking about it, but it's social media that makes the mainstream media globally have to react to it. Whilst really they wouldn't really want to cover these stories. And so what happens then very subsequently is that you have a humanizing of the actual victim. I remember even with the Las Vegas or Charleston or like with the Ontario sort of attacks, you always remember the perpetrator, but you never remember the victims. And if it was the other way around, you know everything about the victims, but you don't, and you only know about the certain selected moments of the actual perpetrator, if it was a Muslim terrorist and so on. So you have a situation where the narrative is being spun in such a way where people are being made to feel sympathy towards white perpetrators and almost no feeling towards people of color, and especially Muslims nowadays. And media understands that this is, what they're doing is propaganda, and propaganda is about feelings. It's not about facts at all. So, and the reason why I'm highlighting that to your question is because when we have this cycle of essentially trying to create a situation where people's lives are more equal than others, you're going to get an escalation of violence towards that are committed by a certain type of people. What we see is essentially white nationalists. This is not a new thing. It's been going on since for a very long time. I remember having debates for almost 10 years when it comes to the FBI figures and the Europol figures, that by the vast majority, it is white terrorists that are causing terrorism. It's not Muslims, it's not Jews, it's not any others. We only make a very tiny proportion. But after years of propaganda, there is this notion that they are the ones they are the good guys who need to defend themselves against the Muslim problem, the immigrant problem, anybody who is seen to be not white. And so when you have this culture of racism, of xenophobia, of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, all that sort of stuff, when you have that ingrained within the institutions of power and of the media, you're going to get more occasions where more mosques, more synagogues that are going to be under attack. And this is and fair enough, maybe before we haven't seen it in such a high-profile way. But given that we've seen it many times on many mosques and many institutions in a high-profile way, we have to, at least from a Muslim perspective, what is the Muslim community going to do about that? Because yes, okay, there's an emphasis on media, there is an emphasis on the government, on Theresa May's government in the UK, but we have to acknowledge the fact that Theresa May's government is racist, it's Islamophobic. So what's the point of just simply begging a government to send police in, which they've cut by the hundreds of thousands? What's the point of begging our racist government to seek protection when they're the ones that's demonizing you? There has to be, first of all, a push for civil sort of society engagement where they are making steps to protect their own congregations, martial arts classes, basic provision for people that are going to be likely to be attacked on the street, especially, you know, the Muslim sisters out there. Secondly, is that are they building relationships with counsellors? Are they pushing? Are they lobbying for Islamophobia to be outlawed? Is that happening on a local, on a national level? Is there a calling for the scrapping of Prevent, which is being used by the government to institutionalize Islamophobic ideas? So the same reasons why, you know, the Muslims in New Zealand are being shut up in the mosques is the same reason why Prevent is essentially stigmatizing students on campus, or like children being referred. Toddlers are being referred just by like the way that they speak, you know. So like these are things in which the Muslim community need to get organized about, and to essentially demand their equality and their freedom. Because if we don't get our story across, then it's just going to be the same old story that is the white Western is the hero of the world who needs to police the rest of the world. And we are the people that essentially, yes, okay, we suffer, but really we're the ones that need to be civilized. We're the ones that need to be curtailed and controlled around the world and in our own homes.
Charles, in your view, how serious a danger is white nationalism? Let's call it what it is. It's ethno-supremacism. It's the concept that many of the people in this room are the white man's burden, and that once upon a time we ruled them, and they are lucky to be here. And if they're going to be here, they really need to watch their P's and Q's. There is in our country, and in every white majority country, a segment of the population that hates people of color. Is it racism? Is it about religion? And how dangerous are these people? How dangerous are the state treating the emergence of these people again in an organized form?
It's interesting, actually, that you asked me this question, because I was thinking if I get a chance to speak again, I'm going to address the issue of perspective, which hinges on what you've just said. We've had this week, I think, some really excellent speakers, and I don't disagree with anything that has been said. But having said that, it is important to keep a sense of perspective about the extent to which this is a danger to society, and particularly a danger to what might be called the Muslim community. In the same way that we need to acknowledge, and I think that was broadly accepted, that there are people within the broad Muslim community who do the Muslim community absolutely no favours whatsoever by carrying out what are then called, understandably, extremist acts. The fact is that whilst in the Muslim community, the kind of grievances we've heard today are widespread, whether you're talking to politicians, to taxi drivers or whoever, you get the same feeling of grievance, and understandably so, given the subject matter today and other issues that have been discussed. But only a very tiny number of those people are going to actually take extremist action like carrying out violence. And it's exactly the same on the other side of this polarizing fence, where you have a white community that I suspect a large proportion, I won't say a majority, but a large number of people in the white community feel that they are somehow under attack, that they feel that they are themselves being marginalized in what they would call their own country. So I think what you will find is, and we're going to see more of this, I'm afraid, is that you're going to see violence feeding off itself. So that, for example, we saw the New Zealand attacker explicitly referred repeatedly in his long monologue, even writing the names of victims on his weapons. He referred to this as, at least in part, a revenge attack for the attacks that Muslims had carried out themselves.
Going back centuries.
Going back centuries, exactly, to famous battles and so on, and also to recently, for example, the Stockholm incidents and so on. And so you've got this situation where actually extremists on both sides of this debate need each other. They feed off each other. And of course, that then feeds into the discourse of the media and government itself, which is what we've already discussed. But keeping things in perspective, only a very small number of people in what might be called loosely Western white communities feel in the way that this person was justified. We need to keep a perspective on that. The security services are taking action against these people. We mentioned Prevent. I think for the first time this year, I think it was, the numbers of people being referred to the PREVENT program, which is the government's de-radicalisation program for people outside the country, so that they know about that. The numbers of people now being referred to PREVENT who are non-Muslim have equaled, you would say probably at last, the numbers of Muslims who are being referred. That's a report I saw recently. I'm reporting it as if it's true. In other words, far-right extremism is being reported to these de-radicalisation programs. That's without me saying that they are successful, of course, these programs. I'm not going to get into that discussion. So in other words, this is a factor that, as you correctly said at the beginning of the program, the state is waking up to. But unfortunately, you have a situation where, as I mentioned, you've got both sides feeding off and then using each other as examples to support as evidence their own propaganda that they are being targeted. The perspective needs to be kept that the numbers are small. The danger comes that people these days, only individuals, as we saw with this individual in New Zealand, can by themselves cause enormous damage. And that's particularly a case where, like in New Zealand, where as the Vox Pops, the people in the street said earlier, that you had, because of the firearms legislation there, you had ease of access to weapons, which allowed him to carry out this kind of massacre. But as has also been correctly said, as we've seen in Nice and elsewhere, for example, in Europe, you only need to be able to get hold of a lorry or a knife and so on, and you can still kill lots of people. And so, yes, the threat is there. The threat is being recognised by Western governments. And indeed, as I alluded to earlier, they're using that threat as a means, as partly to clamp down on alternative viewpoints. But it still needs to be kept in perspective.
Alas, that's the end of the show. We have toured everywhere from New Zealand to the European mainland to North America. This is not a subject that's going to go away anytime soon. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة on Al Mayadeen television.